December 17, 1944. Cabanatuan Camp, Nueva Ecija Province, Philippines. The monsoon had passed 3 days prior, leaving the compound transformed into a geometric pattern of mud and stagnant water that reflected the corrugated iron roofs like shattered mirrors. In the northwestern corner of the camp, near the punishment barracks where the bamboo stakes stood like silent witnesses to empire and suffering, Technical Sergeant James Mitchell knelt on a bed of broken glass. Shards from sake bottles, shattered window panes, fragments of the civilization that once connected these captors to a world they could no longer recognize. His knees, already scarred from previous punishments, pressed into the jagged edges with a pressure that turned flesh into something beyond pain, into a territory where the body becomes merely witness to its own dissolution. The guards, 3 young men whose uniforms hung loose on frames diminished by the same supply failures that starved their prisoners, stood at prescribed intervals, maintaining the discipline their training demanded, even as their empire crumbled across the Pacific. And then, so softly that at first it seemed merely the wind through the acacia trees, Mitchell began to sing, not defiantly, not loudly, just sang. The war had reached its inevitable conclusion everywhere except in the minds of those who administered it. By December 1944, the Japanese Empire existed primarily as a bureaucratic fiction, maintained through reports that traveled slower than the American submarines that now owned the shipping lanes. Cabanatuan held approximately 2,400 American and Allied prisoners, survivors of Bataan, Corregidor, the death march that had become mythology before it became history. They existed in a state that defied simple categorization, neither alive in any meaningful sense, nor dead enough to escape the machinery of captivity. The camp itself represented Imperial Japanese Army doctrine applied to human warehousing, precise in its geometry, efficient in its cruelty, surprisingly fragile in its infrastructure. The guards received 800 grams of rice daily. The prisoners, 400. Both groups understood this arithmetic represented something beyond mere caloric calculation. Mitchell had arrived at Cabanatuan in May 1942, part of the second wave of prisoners processed through the camp's administrative machinery. Before capture, he had been an aircraft mechanic with the 19th Bombardment Group, a man whose intimate knowledge of Wright R-1820 engines had made him valuable until the spare parts ran out, and value itself became a concept without material foundation. His personnel file, maintained with characteristic Japanese thoroughness, documented 12 infractions: failure to bow promptly, 3 times, possession of contraband reading material, once, suspicion of sabotage, 4 times, unproven, and general insolence, 4 times, a category so broad it encompassed everything from eye contact to breathing patterns considered disrespectful. Each infraction had earned its calculated response: reduced rations, solitary confinement, forced labor details that existed primarily to demonstrate the relationship between disobedience and suffering. The broken glass punishment had been instituted by Lieutenant Watanabe, the camp's assistant commandant, a man who had studied engineering at Waseda University and who now applied systematic thinking to the problem of maintaining order among men who had nothing left to lose except the specific manner of their dying. The glass came from the camp's stockpile of broken bottles, sack primarily, though also medicine bottles, lamp covers, anything that could be shattered into fragments sharp enough to penetrate skin but not large enough to be weaponized. It represented a solution to a particular problem: how to inflict severe pain without causing death, how to punish without reducing the labor force. The guards who supervised Mitchell's punishment, Corporals Tanaka, Yoshida, and Private Kimura, had themselves been transformed by the war into instruments of a policy none of them had authored. Tanaka, 23, had been a school teacher in Osaka, specializing in English literature. He had once taught his students about Walt Whitman, about the American concept of individual dignity, about transcendentalism. Now he stood with a bamboo rod, ready to strike if the prisoner attempted to shift his weight, applying discipline to a man whose language he understood but whose suffering he had learned to categorize as necessary. Yoshida had been a fisherman's son from Hokkaido. Kimura, a factory worker's child from Nagoya. The war had given them authority they had never imagined possessing, along with the moral burden of exercising it. They had watched Mitchell kneel at 600 hours as the morning light turned the camp's dust golden. The procedure was standard. The prisoner removed his shoes, rolled up his ragged trousers, positioned himself on the prepared bed of glass spread across a 2-meter square of packed earth. The glass had been arranged with care, not so deep that kneeling would be impossible, not so shallow that the punishment would lack effect. Mitchell had lowered himself without hesitation, without plea, his face revealing nothing except a concentration that suggested he had traveled somewhere beyond the reach of what his body reported. The guards had noted this in their own internal calculations. After 2 years of administering such punishments, they had developed expertise in reading how men bore pain. Some wept, some cursed, some prayed aloud to gods whose names the guards had learned to recognize. Some simply endured in silence, counting minutes, rationing consciousness. Mitchell did none of these things. For the first 30 minutes, he had remained absolutely still, his breathing shallow and controlled, his eyes focused on some point in the middle distance where the camp fence met the jungle that pressed against civilization's temporary boundary. The guards had relaxed slightly, assuming this would be a routine punishment. Painful, but unremarkable. Then, at 06:30, as the morning work details began to form throughout the camp, Mitchell began to sing, softly. So softly that Tanaka, standing closest, almost missed the first words. The song was Red River Valley, a folk melody that dated to the 1890s, music from a country and era that seemed to belong to a different universe than the one in which Mitchell now knelt. His voice was surprisingly clear, despite his physical condition, a tenor that carried sweetness, even in extremity. From this valley they say you are going. We will miss your bright eyes and sweet smile. The words drifted across the compound, quiet enough that they didn't violate the camp's noise regulations, loud enough that nearby prisoners, forming ranks for morning assembly, turned their heads in wonder. Tanaka felt something shift in his chest, some mechanism that connected his past to his present in a way he had carefully avoided. He had taught this song once in his classroom, explaining American frontier mythology to students who giggled at the romantic sentiment. Now, hearing it emerge from a man whose knees pressed into broken glass, the melody carried a different weight. He glanced at Yoshida, whose face remained expressionless but whose grip on his bamboo rod had loosened slightly. Kimura, youngest of the three, stared at Mitchell with an expression that suggested internal calculation, as if trying to determine whether this singing constituted insolence requiring correction. The camp's routine continued around this small island of melody. Prisoners shuffled toward latrines. Work details organized themselves. The kitchen staff began preparing the morning rice with the precision that made inadequate food at least predictable. But something had changed in the atmospheric pressure of the compound. Other prisoners, hearing Mitchell's voice, began to listen with an intensity that went beyond mere entertainment. They heard in his song something they had almost forgotten, not hope, which had proven itself a luxury none could afford, but rather a reminder that the human capacity to create beauty could survive even this machinery of degradation. Lieutenant Watanabe, emerging from his quarters for morning inspection, heard the singing and paused. His face revealed nothing, but his mind engaged with a problem his training had not prepared him to solve. The punishment was proceeding correctly. The prisoner remained in position. The guards maintained proper vigilance. Discipline was being enforced. Yet something about the singing troubled him in ways he could not immediately categorize. It was not defiance exactly. It was something more subtle, more dangerous. It was dignity. By 0700 hours, blood had begun to seep from beneath Mitchell's knees, darkening the earth around the glass fragments. The pain had transcended mere physical sensation, becoming something more like a presence, a companion that demanded all his concentration to manage. Yet the singing continued, moving through his repertoire of remembered melodies with a deliberateness that suggested careful selection. After Red River Valley, he transitioned to Shenandoah, then Amazing Grace, each song flowing into the next with brief silences between that somehow amplified rather than interrupted their impact. The psychological effect on the guards was complex and troubling. Tanaka found himself remembering his university days with an acuity that felt almost violent. He had believed then in universal human values, in literature's capacity to bridge cultures, in the Enlightenment's promise that reason and art could civilize humanity's darker impulses. That young man seemed impossibly naive now, yet the singing somehow reanimated his existence, forcing Tanaka to acknowledge that the person he had been still lived somewhere inside the person he had become. This recognition carried profound discomfort. It was easier to guard bodies than to guard men who insisted on demonstrating their humanity. Yoshida's reaction was different, more visceral, less intellectual. The fisherman's son had grown up with working songs, melodies that synchronized labor and made bearable what would otherwise have been unbearable. Mitchell's singing reminded him of his father's crew, men who sang while hauling nets, whose voices transformed toil into something approaching transcendence. Here in the Philippines, guarding enemies of the emperor, Yoshida had constructed a careful interior architecture that separated the duty he performed from the man he understood himself to be. The singing threatened that architecture's stability. Kimura, 19 years old and still malleable enough to be genuinely confused, tried to understand whether Mitchell's behavior constituted a punishable offense. The regulations addressed defiance, disobedience, disrespect, clear categories with prescribed responses. But singing, and singing so quietly, with such evident control, without apparent intention to mock or challenge, the manual offered no guidance. He looked to his superiors for direction, but Tanaka and Yoshida seemed equally uncertain, their faces revealing an interior struggle that frightened Kimura more than open conflict would have. Throughout the camp, work had slowed imperceptibly. Prisoners moved through their assigned tasks with mechanical efficiency, but their attention had divided itself, part remaining on immediate necessity, part drawn to the quiet singing that continued in the northwestern corner. Captain Hideaki Saito, the camp's senior medical officer, heard the singing from his small clinic near the administrative compound. A graduate of Keio University's medical school, Saito occupied a peculiar position within the camp's hierarchy, technically subordinate to the commandant, yet possessing authority that derived from his specialized knowledge. He had been treating both prisoners and guards for 2 years, maintaining careful records that documented the progressive deterioration of both populations. His files revealed truths that official reports could not acknowledge, that malnutrition was eroding the guards almost as severely as the prisoners, that disease respected no nationality, that the camp was slowly consuming everyone it contained. Saito walked toward the punishment area with a medical bag that held virtually nothing of therapeutic value. Bandages made from torn sheets, antiseptic diluted to near homeopathic concentrations, morphine that had been exhausted months ago. He approached Tanaka with the careful courtesy that maintained the fiction that they were all professionals performing necessary duties rather than participants in organized cruelty. "How long has he been kneeling?" Saito asked in Japanese, his voice neutral. 90 minutes, sir." He began singing after 30 minutes. Tanaka's response was formally correct, yet something in his tone suggested he was reporting not just duration but phenomenon. Saito observed Mitchell with clinical attention. The prisoner's face had acquired a grayish pallor that indicated shock's early stages, yet his breathing remained controlled, his singing uninterrupted. The blood pooling beneath his knees suggested lacerations of concerning depth, likely requiring suturing if infection was to be prevented, though of course there were no supplies for suturing, no antibiotics for infection, only the body's own capacity for healing or failure to heal. What interested Saito most, however, was not the physical damage but rather Mitchell's psychological state. The singing suggested cognitive resources that should have been overwhelmed by pain signals. It was, in its way, a remarkable demonstration of will. "The punishment duration is 4 hours, correct?" Saito asked, confirming what he already knew. "Yes, sir. Until 1,000 hours." Saito calculated quickly. Another 2.5 hours of this would likely cause permanent nerve damage, possibly infection that could progress to septicemia. Mitchell might die, not from the punishment itself, but from its consequences. Yet intervening would require medical justification that superseded military discipline, a difficult standard to meet when the entire camp's operation depended on maintaining the fiction that punishment served legitimate security purposes. The singing had attracted an audience that pretended not to be an audience. Prisoners working nearby found reasons to move closer to the northwestern corner, carrying supplies, repairing fence sections, conducting maintenance that somehow required their presence within earshot. They did not look directly at Mitchell. Such attention would have invited punishment for themselves, but they listened with an intensity that transformed mere hearing into communion. Some silently mouthed the words they recognized. Others simply absorbed the melodies as proof that something remained unbroken. Among the guards, a debate was occurring through glances and subtle gestures, a conversation conducted in the language of men who dared not speak their doubts aloud. Should the singing be stopped? It violated no specific regulation, yet it clearly disturbed the camp's order in ways that were perhaps more dangerous than open defiance. Defiance could be met with force, with escalated punishment, with the clear logic of power asserting itself. But this singing that somehow made the singer seem more present, more human, more dignified than his position suggested possible. The guards had no doctrine for addressing grace under pressure, no protocol for responding to suffering that refused to diminish its bearer. Lieutenant Watanabe had moved closer, standing far enough away to maintain command distance but close enough to assess the situation directly. His training at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy had emphasized discipline, hierarchy, the subordination of individual feeling to collective purpose. He had learned that effective command required emotional detachment, that sentimentality compromised decision-making, that the enemy must be understood only in terms of threat assessment and resource management. Mitchell challenged all of this simply by singing. The American was simultaneously obeying the punishment, remaining in position, not resisting, accepting the consequences of his infractions, and yet somehow transcending it, turning submission into something that resembled triumph. Watanabe understood that other prisoners were listening, that this moment was being recorded in the camp's collective memory, with an indelibility that would outlast any official report. If he stopped the singing, he would acknowledge its power by revealing his fear of it. If he allowed it to continue, he might seem weak, unable to maintain proper discipline. Both choices carried risk. The correct decision, according to his training, would be to ignore the singing entirely, to treat it as irrelevant to the punishment's purpose. Yet ignoring it felt impossible when everyone, guards and prisoners alike, was clearly absorbed by its meaning. By 0800 hours, Mitchell had been kneeling for 2 hours. His voice had acquired a slight hoarseness, but the singing continued with remarkable consistency. He had moved into hymns now, Abide With Me, Rock of Ages, spiritual songs that carried different freight than the folk melodies. For the Christian prisoners, and there were many, these hymns evoked Sunday services in churches that seemed to belong to a previous lifetime, memories of communities where shared belief had created bonds stronger than what they now endured. Even for the non-religious prisoners, the hymns carried cultural weight, reminders of a civilization that had taught them, however imperfectly, about mercy and redemption. Tanaka, the former English teacher, found himself silently translating the lyrics, an automatic habit from his classroom years. Abide with me, fast falls the eventide. He understood the word's full meaning, the prayer for divine presence during darkness, the acknowledgement of human fragility before mortality's approach. Hearing Mitchell sing these words while kneeling on broken glass created a cognitive dissonance that was almost physically painful. Tanaka had constructed an elaborate mental framework that allowed him to separate his current duty from his former values. That explained why serving his emperor required actions his younger self would have considered unconscionable. The singing was demolishing that framework, forcing him to recognize that the contradiction he had carefully managed was actually an unbridgeable chasm. Father Patrick O'Brien, the camp's unofficial Catholic chaplain, a Maryknoll missionary captured in Manila, had positioned himself at the edge of the work detail near enough to hear. O'Brien had conducted countless clandestine services throughout the camp's existence, whispered masses, baptisms performed with improvised materials, last rites delivered to dying men with such frequency that the ritual had worn grooves in his memory. He recognized in Mitchell singing something he had seen before in extremis, the human soul asserting its existence beyond the body's degradation. O'Brien began to pray silently, not for Mitchell's deliverance. He had long since stopped believing God intervened in such direct ways, but for witness, for the strength to remember accurately when memory became the only available form of justice. Captain Saito had remained nearby, ostensibly to monitor Mitchell's medical condition, but actually fascinated by what he was witnessing. As a physician, he had seen the human body's remarkable capacity for adaptation, for survival under conditions that should have proven fatal. But this was different. Mitchell was not merely surviving. He was demonstrating that consciousness itself could be weaponized against suffering, that the mind could transform torture into testimony. At 8:30, something unexpected occurred. From the southern section of the camp, another voice joined Mitchell's song, then another, then a dozen more. The prisoners were singing softly but audibly, joining the hymn's familiar words. Swift to its close ebbs out life's little day. The voices were weak, damaged by disease and malnutrition, yet their collective power was undeniable. They were not defying orders. Singing was not explicitly forbidden during work hours, but they were clearly transforming Mitchell's individual act into something collective, something that redefined who possessed power in this exchange. Lieutenant Watanabe's face tightened. This required response. He barked orders in Japanese, and guards moved quickly through the work details, using their bamboo rods not to strike but to gesture, to command silence. The singing stopped. Mostly. A few voices continued for several seconds longer, then faded into compliance. But everyone understood what had occurred. The prisoners had demonstrated that Mitchell did not suffer alone, that his pain and his dignity both belonged to a community that included them all. Watanabe walked directly to where Mitchell knelt. He stood close, looking down at the American with an expression that mixed anger, confusion, and something that might have been respect. In precise English, Watanabe had studied at the University of Southern California before the war. He said, "You will stop singing. This is an order." Mitchell looked up, meeting Watanabe's eyes. His face was gray with pain, sweat soaking his tattered shirt, but his gaze remained clear. "Sir," he said quietly, "I cannot. Not, I will not," which would have been defiance, but "I cannot," which suggested a different category of response entirely. "You refuse a direct order?" Watanabe's voice carried warning. "No, sir. I obey the punishment. I remain kneeling as ordered. But the singing, I need it, sir, to stay conscious, to remember who I am." Mitchell's voice remained steady, matter of fact, explaining rather than pleading. This answer created an impossible situation. If Mitchell was using singing as a medical necessity to endure the punishment, then forbidding it might constitute ordering him to fail at compliance. Yet allowing it set a precedent that would undermine the entire disciplinary structure. Watanabe found himself caught in a logical trap constructed by a prisoner who, despite or perhaps because of his suffering, was thinking more clearly than those who inflicted it. Watanabe made his decision. "You may continue," he said stiffly, then walked away before the word's full implication could settle over him. He had essentially granted permission for something that should never have required permission, thereby acknowledging that Mitchell retained certain rights even in his captivity. The other guards noticed this, and something shifted in the camp's invisible architecture of authority. Mitchell resumed singing, but now his voice carried a different quality. "When other helpers fail, and comforts flee, help of the helpless, oh, abide with me." The words seemed to encompass not just his own situation but everyone's, prisoners and guards both. All of them trapped in a machinery none had built, but all were required to operate. The distinction between captor and captive remained absolute in terms of power, yet the singing suggested a shared vulnerability that power could not erase. By 0900 hours, Mitchell had been kneeling for 3 hours. His legs had lost most feeling, which was both mercy and danger. Mercy because the acute pain had given way to numbness. Danger because he could no longer sense how much damage was occurring. Blood had soaked the earth thoroughly around the glass bed. His voice had weakened but not stopped, moving now through songs that seemed randomly selected. Home on the Range, Danny Boy, the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Each song was a piece of remembered America, a fragment of the country he might never see again. Captain Saito checked his watch repeatedly, calculating. At 1000 hours, the punishment would end. Mitchell would need to stand, to walk back to his barracks, to somehow continue existing with whatever injuries he had sustained. Saito prepared himself to provide what minimal medical care he could offer, knowing it would be inadequate, knowing the real treatment Mitchell needed, rest, nutrition, antibiotics, professional wound care, existed only in theory. The morning work details had completed their tasks with unusual efficiency, driven by a collective desire to be present when Mitchell finally rose. Prisoners had learned not to hope. Hope was a resource too expensive to afford, but they felt something different now, a kind of fierce attention, a determination to witness whatever happened next. They had seen men die in this camp, seen them give up, seen them collapse into despair so complete it became indistinguishable from death itself. Mitchell's continued singing suggested an alternative they had almost forgotten existed. At 0945 hours, 15 minutes before the punishment's scheduled conclusion, Mitchell's voice finally broke. Not dramatically, he did not cry out or collapse, but the singing simply stopped mid-phrase, as if the machinery that had sustained it for 3.5 hours had finally exceeded its operational capacity. He remained kneeling, eyes open but focused on nothing, his breathing shallow and rapid. The silence he left behind felt heavier than his singing had. Tanaka stepped forward instinctively, then caught himself. Intervening before the designated time would be a breach of discipline, yet watching Mitchell's consciousness begin to fade felt suddenly unbearable. The American had demonstrated something that Tanaka's education had taught him to value: stoic endurance, grace under pressure, the kind of character the ancient Greeks called arete. How had he arrived at a place where such character was being systematically destroyed by his own hand? Captain Saito moved closer, medically justified. "Lieutenant," he called to Watanabe, "the prisoner is approaching shock. If the punishment continues, he may sustain permanent injury." Watanabe's face revealed his calculation. 15 minutes. He could end it now, showing mercy and wisdom, or he could enforce the full duration, demonstrating that discipline was absolute. Both choices carried meaning that would reverberate through the camp. He thought of his own training, the instructions he had received about maintaining order among enemy prisoners. Be firm, be fair, be feared. Yet Mitchell had somehow transformed punishment into something else, something that made fairness seem like a concept from a different universe. "End the punishment," Watanabe said quietly. "Remove him to the medical facility." Tanaka and Yoshida moved immediately to Mitchell's sides. Lifting him required careful coordination. His legs could not support weight. His knees had effectively fused to the broken glass through blood and tissue damage. Tanaka whispered in English, "We lift you now. Do not try to stand." Mitchell's eyes flickered recognition but nothing else. Together, the two guards raised him, glass shards pulling free from his flesh with sounds that would haunt them both afterward, and carried him toward Saito's clinic. The work details watched silently. No one cheered. Cheering would have been punished immediately. But something passed through the assembled prisoners. Some recognition that what they had witnessed mattered, that Mitchell had accomplished something important, even if none of them could fully articulate what it was. In the clinic, Captain Saito worked with the limited resources available to him. He cleaned Mitchell's wounds with boiled water, removed glass fragments still embedded in the tissue, applied bandages that were clean if inadequate. Mitchell remained semi-conscious throughout, occasionally murmuring words that might have been song lyrics or prayer. His knees would heal, Saito judged, though the scarring would be extensive and permanent. Whether infection would develop remained uncertain, a question that would be answered in the days ahead by factors beyond anyone's control. "Why did you sing?" Saito asked quietly in English, not expecting answer but unable to contain his curiosity. Mitchell's eyes opened slightly. His voice was barely audible. "To remember who I am, to remind them who they are." The answer struck Saito with unexpected force. Mitchell had been singing not just for himself but for the guards, offering them something they had not known they needed, a mirror that reflected their own humanity back at them. It was an extraordinary act of moral courage, perhaps more demanding than physical courage because it required maintaining belief in human dignity under conditions systematically designed to destroy that belief. Father O'Brien arrived at the clinic shortly after, having received unofficial permission to administer spiritual care. He sat beside Mitchell's cot, silent at first, then began to pray quietly, not the prayers of intercession or petition, but prayers of witness, of presence, acknowledgments that what Mitchell had endured mattered in the cosmic accounting, even if it changed nothing in the immediate circumstance. Throughout that day and the days following, the story of Mitchell's singing spread through the camp's informal communication networks. Details were elaborated, meaning was debated, but the essential fact remained. A man had knelt on broken glass for hours and responded by singing. Other prisoners drew from this what they needed: proof of endurance, evidence of dignity's persistence, reminder that they remained human beings rather than merely bodies being warehoused toward death. For the guards, particularly Tanaka, the effect was more disturbing. The singing had forced them to see what they had trained themselves not to see, that the prisoners they guarded were not abstractions, not enemies in some ideological sense, but individuals possessed of the same capacities for courage and grace that their own culture claimed to value above all else. This recognition carried implications too dangerous to examine directly, yet too powerful to fully suppress. On January 30th, 1945, 6 weeks after Mitchell's punishment, American Rangers and Filipino guerrillas raided Cabanatuan in what would become known as one of the war's most successful rescue operations. The raid was executed with remarkable precision, 30 minutes from first shot to final withdrawal, with 511 prisoners liberated and only minimal casualties among the rescuers. The Japanese guards, weakened by the same privations that had diminished their prisoners, offered less resistance than expected. Some fled, some fought, some simply stopped, as if released from obligation. Mitchell was among those carried out on improvised stretchers. His knees had healed incompletely, leaving him unable to walk long distances. But he was conscious, aware, still singing quietly as the rescue team moved through the jungle night toward American lines. The rangers who carried him listened to his singing with a mixture of awe and incomprehension. How did men survive this? How did they remain themselves? Tanaka was not present at the raid. He had been transferred 2 weeks earlier to a unit preparing defenses in Luzon's mountains, part of the Empire's final desperate preparations for an invasion everyone knew was coming. But he carried with him the memory of Mitchell's singing, a memory that would survive Japan's surrender, the subsequent occupation, his own difficult return to civilian life. Years later, when Tanaka resumed teaching, he would tell his students about the American prisoner who sang while kneeling on broken glass, not as a war story exactly, but as testimony about human capacity for transcendence. Lieutenant Watanabe was killed during the raid, shot while attempting to organize a defensive response. He died quickly, without time for reflection on what his service had meant or what he might have done differently. Captain Saito survived, surrendered, spent time in a POW camp where he was treated with scrupulous correctness by American guards who seemed confused by his evident relief at being captured. He would later write a memoir that documented the Cabanatuan camp's medical conditions with clinical precision, and in its final chapter, he devoted 3 pages to describing Mitchell's punishment and singing, calling it, "The moment I began to understand what I had lost by forgetting what it meant to be human." The broken glass remained in the northwestern corner of the camp, pressed into the earth, waiting to be reclaimed by jungle that would slowly erase evidence of what had occurred there. In the official records, Technical Sergeant James Mitchell's punishment on December 17, 1944, is documented in a single line: disciplinary action administered per regulations, 4 hours duration. The report contains no mention of singing, no acknowledgement of what that singing meant or accomplished. The bureaucracy of war has no vocabulary for describing grace under pressure, no forms for recording how human dignity persists despite systematic efforts to extinguish it. Mitchell returned to the United States in March 1945, initially to a hospital in San Francisco, where doctors addressed the physical damage, not just from the glass punishment, but from 2 years of malnutrition, disease, and systematic brutality. His knees never fully recovered. He walked with a slight limp for the rest of his life, but he walked. He returned to civilian life, worked as an aircraft mechanic again, married, raised 3 children, attended church every Sunday where he sang hymns with a voice that remained surprisingly clear despite everything. He rarely spoke about his captivity. When pressed, he would say only that he had done what was necessary to survive, that singing had helped him remember who he was, when everything else tried to convince him he was something less than human. His children learned fragments of the story over decades, piecing together a narrative their father seemed reluctant to claim as important. Only near the end of his life, when age had stripped away the protective reticence of middle years, did Mitchell speak more fully about what he had endured and how he had endured it. "I sang," he told his daughter, "because silence would have meant surrender. Not to them, they already had my body, but to despair, to the belief that what they did to me defined what I was. I needed to remember I was more than my circumstances, that I could create beauty even while experiencing ugliness." The singing wasn't defiance exactly, it was affirmation, a way of saying, I am still here, still human, still capable of offering something to the world beyond my suffering. Technical Sergeant James Mitchell died in 1998 at age 78, surrounded by family who had only partially understood what he had survived. He was buried with military honors, and at his funeral, the congregation sang, "Abide with me." The lesson persists. In the darkest places where power seeks to reduce human beings to mere objects of control, the simplest acts of human creativity become revolutionary. They did not break him. They could not, because he sang.